Content warning. This video discusses the topics of sexual harassment, sexual misconduct, and sexual assault.
We are a community of learners. Everyone who comes here, student or employee, is here to learn, to achieve their goals, and fulfill their dreams. And we support one another in achieving those goals and dreams. JMU values a community that is respectful and inclusive for everyone.
Causing harm to someone else is a violation of our community expectations. When even one member of our community is harmed, it hurts all of us. Everyone in our community is expected to treat one another with respect, to know and understand the behaviors that are prohibited, and to help prevent harm from occurring. In this video, we will share with you the behaviors of a sexual nature that are not welcome in our community. Our hope is that this will prevent this behavior from occurring, and empower you to know that JMU is ready to support you, should you unfortunately experience any of these behaviors.
There are two distinct policies that address prohibited behaviors that are sexual in nature. The Sexual Misconduct Policy, which we will return to shortly, and the Title IX Sexual Harassment Policy. Title IX is a section of the Higher Education Act which prohibits discriminations based on sex, sexual orientation, gender, and gender identity. If there is a formal complaint, and the alleged conduct falls within the jurisdiction and meets the definitions of the Title IX Sexual Harassment Policy, it must be investigated by the Title IX office.
Title IX sexual harassment applies only to behavior that meets the definitions provided by Title IX and are reported by university community members, which may include faculty, staff, and more. Also, Title IX jurisdiction is limited to educational programs or activities, which include locations, events, or circumstances over which the university exercised substantial control of the respondent, the person alleged to have violated the policy, and substantial control over the context in which the behavior occurred, including any building owned or controlled by a student organization that is officially recognized by the university. Title IX sexual harassment only covers conduct occurring within the United States.
The Sexual Misconduct Policy applies more broadly than the Title IX Sexual Harassment Policy and addresses a wider range of behaviors. Anyone, whether a member of the university community or not, can have a report of sexual misconduct investigated under this policy, assuming one of these three conditions is met. 1. A substantial portion of the alleged sexual misconduct occurred on university-controlled, owned, or leased property. 2. A substantial portion of the alleged behavior occurred during an official university program or activity or had a significant connection to or effect on a program or activity. Or 3. The alleged sexual misconduct had a significant connection to or effect on the learning or working environment at JMU for the reporter. The Sexual Misconduct Policy also applies to study abroad programs.
While the Title IX sexual harassment and sexual misconduct adjudication processes are similar in many ways, there are significant differences, which can be found in the procedures in the student handbook. And remember, sexual misconduct and Title IX sexual harassment incidents can involve persons of the same or different sex, sexual orientation, gender, or gender identity. Since the Sexual Misconduct Policy covers a wider range of behavior types, we'll discuss these first before looking at the behaviors covered by Title IX sexual harassment.
Sexual misconduct encompasses forms of power-based interpersonal violence that cause harm to individuals, go against everything that JMU stands for, and violate the university's expectations. Over the next few minutes, we're going to discuss each of the 7 major behaviors that fall under sexual misconduct. We'll be using direct and upfront language to review these topics. The full policies are available online at jmu.edu/handbook.
The first behavior covered by the Sexual Misconduct Policy is sexual assault. Sexual assault is any non-consensual physical contact of a sexual nature. If there is physical, sexual contact, or attempts at physical, sexual contact and there isn't consent, it's sexual assault. But because consent is central to determining if something is sexual assault, it's imperative that everyone understands when consent is and isn't present.
Consent is an outward demonstration through understandable words or actions that convey a knowing and voluntary agreement to engage in mutually agreed upon sexual activity. Consent is something that doesn't exist until it is communicated by your partner. If they haven't communicated it in some way, it isn't present. It is your responsibility to make sure that you understand what your partner is and isn't communicating in your intimate moments. Consent is required for each sexual act you engage in. It doesn't carry over from one interaction with your partner to the next, and it can be withdrawn at any time. We are going to provide some examples of when consent may be communicated, but it is not valid or is no longer valid.
First, if a person communicates consent and then communicates that they no longer consent, the consent has been withdrawn, making the original communication of consent no longer valid. If sexual activity were to continue after the consent is withdrawn, it would be sexual assault.
Second, if a person is forced, coerced, or intimidated into consenting, the consent that was communicated isn't valid.
And lastly, no matter what a person who is incapacitated says or does, they cannot consent to sexual activity. Any consent communicated by an incapacitated person isn't valid. A person is incapacitated when they cannot make informed, rational judgments. This may be due to their age, disability, because they're asleep or unconscious, or because of their use of substances. If a person is intoxicated to the point that they cannot make informed, rational judgments, then they are incapacitated. And it doesn't matter if they choose to consume substances at that level or if someone forced them to. If they're incapacitated, they can't consent, period.
The second behavior found in the sexual misconduct policy is sexual exploitation, which means taking sexual advantage of someone without that person's consent. Some examples of this could be sharing sexual photos or videos without consent, taking or creating sexual photos or videos without consent, or knowingly spreading sexually transmitted diseases to a partner. Anything that removes a person's autonomy to make their own sexual decisions would violate this aspect of the sexual misconduct policy. The third behavior is sexual harassment. Sexual harassment is defined in the sexual misconduct policy is verbal, nonverbal, or physical conduct of a sexual nature that is a term or condition of employment, education, or membership. Verbal, nonverbal, or physical conduct of a sexual nature that creates a hostile environment is also sexual harassment. Sexual jokes, comments, stories, writing, gestures, and motions can all rise to the level of sexual harassment. Unwelcome or offensive sexual advances, whistling, catcalling, and leering all can too. If someone is required to endure these behaviors due to their job or their studies, or if they are significantly severe, persistent, or pervasive, the person doing these things is violating the sexual misconduct policy.
The fourth behavior, covered in the sexual misconduct policy, is dating violence. This is a form of sexual violence committed by a person who is or has been in a social relationship of a romantic or intimate nature with another person. Sexual violence refers to physical sexual acts perpetrated against a person's will or where a person is incapable of giving consent. If your intimate partner engages in sexual acts with you when you are drunk to the point of incapacitation, it is dating violence. Domestic violence is the fifth behavior covered in the sexual misconduct policy. This occurs when a crime of violence occurs within the context of an existing or former intimate relationship. Crimes of violence include, among other things, assault, damage of property, and forcible sex offenses. If someone is assaulted by their intimate partner, JMU is here for them.
Sixth, there is stalking. Stalking happens when someone engages in a course of conduct directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to fear for their safety or the safety of others, or suffer substantial emotional distress. Social media can absolutely be involved, but stalking is more than just liking an old tweet or Instagram post. It's a pattern of serious and specific behavior. Seventh, and finally, we want to talk about non-consensual relationships. The university prohibits sexual relationships between university community members that are influenced by fear or coercion or where a power difference exists. For example, generally, faculty and staff may not date or have sexual relationships with students. Supervisors may not date or have sexual relationships with people they supervise, and residence hall staff, like RAs and hall directors, may not date or have sexual relationships with residents in their halls. There are more examples we could give, but we just want to share the general idea of what we mean by power difference.
Now we'll return to the Title IX sexual harassment policy and highlight where the scope of behavior and definitions are the same and where they differ from sexual misconduct in JMU policy. Sexual harassment under Title IX is behavior that meets at least one of three conditions.
First, something is sexual harassment if it is quid pro quo, that is, where an employee, including student employees, requests unwelcome sexual conduct in exchange for aid, benefits, or services. If a student employee, for example, offers to provide a job-related benefit in exchange for a sexual favor, that is sexual harassment.
Second, sexual harassment can be unwelcome verbal conduct that a reasonable person considers to be so severe, pervasive, and persistent that it denies equal access to the university's programs or activities. For instance, it may be sexual harassment if you become scared to go to a class because a classmate is regularly making unwelcome sexual comments to you during the class, and you are unable to complete your classwork.
Third, something is Title IX sexual harassment if it meets the definition of sexual assault, dating violence, domestic violence, or stalking. Dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking are defined the same way in JMU's Title IX sexual harassment and sexual misconduct policies. Sexual assault, however, is specifically defined under Title IX sexual harassment to mean a sexual act committed against another person without consent and is limited to 4 acts: rape, fondling, incest, and statutory rape. Attempts to rape are also included.
It is important to know the definitions of rape and fondling used for Title IX sexual harassment. Rape is penetration, no matter how slight, of the vagina or anus with any body part or object, or oral penetration by a sex organ of another person without the consent of the victim. Fondling means the touching of the private body parts of another person for the purpose of sexual gratification without the consent of the victim.
All the behaviors we've just discussed, whether they fall under the sexual misconduct policy or Title IX sexual harassment policy, go against our values as a university. JMU can impose any level of sanction ranging from probation and educational sanctions up to and including suspension or expulsion from the university for any act of sexual misconduct or Title IX sexual harassment. However, JMU considers acts of sexual violence to be the most serious and therefore typically imposes the most severe sanctions when a student is found responsible for such offenses, including suspension or expulsion from the university. JMU has suspended and expelled students for violations of a sexual nature and will continue to do so when that is the appropriate outcome.
For more information on the sexual misconduct in Title IX sexual harassment policies, or the processes used to investigate and/or adjudicate such allegations, visit jmu.edu/handbook or jmu.edu/Title IX. If you only remember 3 things from this video, it should be 1. Sexual misconduct in Title IX sexual harassment encompasses a wide range of behaviors. 2. Sexual misconduct and Title IX sexual harassment are prohibited at JMU. And 3. If you or someone else experience any of these behaviors, JMU wants to help.